A pretty face can get someone into a room, but it takes a brilliant mind to save everyone inside it. The words were never spoken aloud that night, but they would become the truth that changed the Romano Empire forever. In the heart of Manhattan, 50 floors above the city lights, a room filled with powerful men was about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. They looked at Elena Carter and saw only what was easiest to see. They saw the elegant black dress, the calm expression, the woman standing quietly beside the most feared businessman in the city. They saw a secretary. They saw decoration. They saw someone who belonged in the background. They never imagined she was the only person in the room who understood what was really happening. The conference room of Romano International glowed beneath warm golden lights, reflecting off the polished glass table where executives, investors, and longtime associates gathered for a deal worth more than $800 million. At the center sat Alessandro Romano, a man known for his discipline, his intelligence, and his ability to control any situation with a single look. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his posture calm, his attention fixed on the documents before him. Beside him stood Elena, holding a tablet filled with notes she had prepared hours before anyone else arrived. For 5 years she had been the person who organized his schedule, reviewed his reports, and noticed details others ignored. But to most people in that room, she was simply the woman who brought coffee, arranged meetings, and stood quietly behind the man in charge. Alessandro, one of the investors said with a small laugh, leaning back in his chair, "Are we really including your assistant in a conversation like this?" Few people smiled. Another executive glanced at Elena and shook his head. "No offense, but this is a serious business discussion. We need people who understand numbers, not just someone taking notes." The room filled with quiet laughter. Elena heard every word. She felt the familiar weight of being underestimated, the same feeling she had carried since the first day she entered a world where people judged before they listened. But she did not react. She simply lowered her eyes to the tablet and continued reviewing the information in front of her. Because Elena Carter had learned something important. People revealed the most when they believed you were invisible. Alessandro noticed the comments, but he said nothing. His silence was impossible to read. Some saw it as agreement. Elena knew better. She had worked beside him long enough to understand that his silence meant he was observing. Still, even he did not realize what she had discovered only 30 minutes earlier. As the meeting continued, Elena's attention remained on one specific page of the contract. A single number appeared out of place. A small detail that most people would ignore. A detail that could change everything. She looked around the table at the confident faces of people celebrating a victory that had not happened yet. Then she looked at Alessandro, the man everyone feared and respected. The man who believed he could always see betrayal coming. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tablet. She had a choice. She could stay quiet and remain the invisible secretary everyone expected her to be. Or she could speak and risk losing the only position where she had earned his trust. For years, Elena had allowed people to underestimate her. She had learned that intelligence did not need to announce itself. It simply waited for the right moment. But this was different. This was not about proving she was smarter than them. This was about protecting someone who had trusted her with everything. The room continued discussing numbers, profits, and future plans. Nobody noticed the woman standing near the window. Nobody noticed the way her expression changed. Nobody noticed that the person they dismissed as a pretty face had already found the secret hidden inside their perfect deal. And in that moment, Elena Carter made a decision that would expose a betrayal no one saw coming. The room was still laughing, but soon it would be completely silent. Long before anyone in that conference room questioned her abilities, Elena Carter had already learned how to survive in rooms where people underestimated her. She had discovered that confidence did not always come from speaking the loudest. Sometimes it came from knowing exactly what others had missed. 5 years earlier, Elena had walked into Romano International carrying a small notebook, a carefully prepared resume, and a determination to rebuild her life. She was not looking for power. She was looking for an opportunity. At the time, she had already experienced what it felt like to have her intelligence ignored because people focused on appearances before character. She had worked as a financial analyst for a respected firm in Chicago, where she spent years studying contracts, market trends, and business strategies. She had a talent for finding patterns hidden inside complicated information. But after a corporate dispute where her warnings were ignored, she realized that being right was not always enough. Sometimes people only listened when they were ready to admit they needed the truth. That lesson brought her to Alessandro Romano. When Elena first entered his office for her interview, she expected another powerful executive who would barely look at her. Instead, Alessandro studied her resume carefully. He noticed the details others had overlooked. He noticed that she had solved problems no one else wanted to touch. He noticed that every recommendation from her previous employers mentioned the same thing. Elena Carter saw what others failed to see. Why leave finance? Alessandro had asked that day. Elena remembered sitting across from him in the quiet office, surrounded by expensive furniture, and the kind of success that seemed impossible for ordinary people to reach. Because I want to work somewhere my judgment matters, she answered. It was a simple response, but Alessandro understood it. He did not hire her because she was charming. He hired her because she was capable. Over the years, Elena became the person who knew the details behind every important decision. She organized meetings, reviewed reports, and prepared information before anyone realized they needed it. She remembered every deadline, every concern, every small change that could affect a major decision. She never demanded recognition. She never needed a room full of people to know her name. But outside Alessandro's office, people created their own assumptions. They saw a beautiful woman beside a powerful man and decided they already understood her story. They never saw the nights she stayed late reviewing documents under the soft glow of her desk lamp. They never saw the countless times she quietly corrected mistakes before they became problems. They never saw the discipline behind her calm expression. To them, she was simply Alessandro Romano's secretary. But Alessandro knew something different. He knew that when a difficult question appeared, Elena was usually the first person to find the answer. Still, even he had never fully understood how far ahead she was thinking. Because Elena had a habit that made her different from everyone else. She did not only listen to what people said. She paid attention to what they avoided saying. And now, sitting in that conference room surrounded by confident executives, she recognized the same warning signs she had seen years before. The unusual numbers. The rushed decisions. The missing details hidden between ordinary pages. A person who wanted to hide something always believed small things would never be noticed. But Elena noticed everything. She looked at the contract again and felt the weight of the decision ahead. For 5 years, she had protected Alessandro's time, his reputation, and his business. She had done it quietly because loyalty was not about receiving praise. It was about doing what was right when nobody was watching. The conversation around the table continued, but Elena was no longer focused on the voices around her. Her mind was already connecting the pieces. She knew something was wrong. She just did not know yet who had placed the mistake there. And as she watched the people celebrating a deal that was not as safe as they believed, Elena understood one thing clearly. The truth was hidden in the details, and she was the only person willing to look closely enough to find it. The conference room remained filled with confident voices, but Elena Carter was no longer listening to the celebration around her. Her attention was fixed on the contract displayed on the large screen at the end of the table. To everyone else it looked perfect. The numbers were impressive. The presentation was polished. The future seemed certain. But Elena had learned that the most dangerous problems were often hidden inside things that looked flawless. She quietly reviewed the documents again, tracing each section with careful attention. A small adjustment in the financial projections. A timeline that did not match the original proposal. A clause written in language that seemed harmless but created an unusual advantage for one side. Each detail alone could be explained. Together they told a different story. Someone had changed the agreement before it reached Alessandro Romano. Elena slowly looked across the table. The people around her were discussing expansion plans and celebrating what they believed was a successful partnership. Nobody seemed concerned. Nobody seemed to notice. But Elena had spent years learning how important it was to recognize the moment before a problem became impossible to fix. She waited until the conversation slowed. Then she spoke. There is something we need to review before moving forward. The room became quieter. Several people turned toward her with surprised expressions. The same people who had laughed earlier now looked confused that she had interrupted them. One executive leaned back and smiled politely. "Elena, we appreciate your attention to detail, but the legal team has already reviewed everything." His tone was respectful on the surface, but the message was clear. He did not believe she belonged in the conversation. Elena remained calm. "I understand that, but there is a section here that deserves another look." She walked toward the screen and pointed to the specific paragraph. "This wording changes the responsibility structure. It appears balanced, but it gives one party more control over future decisions." A few people exchanged glances. The room was no longer laughing. Alessandro watched her carefully from his seat. He had seen Elena handle difficult situations before, but this was different. This time she was challenging a room full of people who believed they were the smartest ones there. "Are you saying our legal team missed something?" another executive asked. Elena paused before answering. "I am saying everyone can miss something when they are focused on the bigger picture. Details are easy to overlook when people are excited about success." Her response was not defensive. It was simply the truth. Alessandro looked back at the documents. For the first time during the meeting, he stopped thinking about the opportunity and started examining the risk. He knew Elena well enough to understand that she never interrupted without a reason. She was careful with her words, careful with her timing, careful with everything. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The confidence that filled the room earlier was replaced by uncertainty. Elena returned to her place beside the table, but she could feel the questions surrounding her. Who was she to challenge this deal? Why did Alessandro listen to her? What did she know that they did not? The answers were not visible yet. But Elena knew one thing. The person responsible for the hidden changes had counted on everyone looking at the obvious parts of the agreement. They expected people to admire the size of the deal, the reputation of the companies involved, and the appearance of success. They never expected someone to look deeper. As the meeting ended, Alessandro stayed behind with the documents in his hand. The city lights reflected across the glass walls of the office, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he looked at Elena. "How long have you suspected something was wrong?" She met his eyes calmly. "I did not suspect anything until I saw the details." Alessandro looked back at the papers. He understood the difference. Elena was not making accusations. She was following facts. And somewhere inside those facts was a truth that someone had worked very hard to keep hidden. The question was no longer whether something was wrong. The question was who had been responsible for placing it there. The office was quieter than it had been all evening. The voices that once filled the conference room with confidence had disappeared, leaving only the soft sound of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Alessandro Romano stood near his desk, holding the contract Elena Carter had questioned only hours earlier. For the first time in a long time, he was not looking at a business opportunity. He was looking for the truth hidden beneath it. Elena remained across from him, standing calmly with the same patience she had shown every day for the past 5 years. She was not demanding recognition. She was not waiting for praise. She was simply waiting for him to understand what she had already seen. Alessandro looked through the pages again. "Show me exactly what you found." His voice was steady, but Elena noticed something different. There was no doubt in his tone anymore. There was curiosity. She walked toward the desk and opened the documents on his computer. "The original proposal from 3 months ago had a different structure," she explained. "The numbers were adjusted slightly, but the important change is here." She pointed to a section that appeared ordinary at first glance. "This clause changes decision authority after the first year. It looks like a standard partnership term, but it creates an imbalance that could limit our control." Alessandro studied the information silently. He had built his reputation on making careful decisions. He surrounded himself with experienced advisors, talented professionals, and people who understood his industry. But Elena had found something that everyone else overlooked. Not because she had more resources, not because she had more power, because she paid attention. "How did you notice this?" he asked. Elena looked at the document for a moment before answering. "Because it did not sound like the rest of the agreement." Alessandro raised an eyebrow slightly. "The wording. The intention behind the wording," she replied. Most people read contracts by looking for what is written. I also look for what someone is trying not to say. The answer stayed in the room. Alessandro had heard countless explanations from executives who wanted to impress him. But Elena was different. She never tried to appear smarter than anyone else. She simply focused on solving the problem. That was what made her valuable. The next morning, Alessandro called a private review meeting. The same executives who had dismissed Elena the day before arrived with the same confidence. They expected a routine discussion. They expected the deal to move forward. They did not expect questions. When Alessandro placed the revised documents on the table, the atmosphere changed immediately. "We are reviewing several details before final approval," he said. One executive looked surprised. "Is there a problem?" Alessandro did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Elena. For years, she had stood behind him during meetings, taking notes while others spoke. This time, he invited her forward. Elena found inconsistencies that require clarification. The room became still. The same people who had ignored her opinions were now listening carefully. Elena explained the concerns with confidence and precision. She did not attack anyone. She did not make accusations. She simply presented facts. And facts had a way of changing the entire conversation. By the end of the meeting, everyone understood that the situation was more complicated than they first believed. Alessandro watched the reactions around the table. He noticed something he had not considered before. The people who questioned Elena's role had only judged what they could see. They saw her appearance. They saw her position. They never saw the discipline, intelligence, and loyalty behind it. Later that evening, Alessandro stood alone in his office, thinking about every decision she had helped him make over the years. He realized Elena had never been trying to stand beside his power. She had been quietly protecting it. And for the first time, Alessandro wondered how many times she had saved him from problems he never even knew existed. But Elena soon discovered that being recognized was not the same as being accepted. In a company where reputation had been built over decades, one successful presentation could not erase years of assumptions. Some people respected her new role, but others saw it as a threat to the way things had always been done. The same executives who once ignored her now watched her carefully, waiting for a mistake that would prove they were right about her. Elena understood that the hardest part of earning respect was not showing what she could do. It was proving that her success was not temporary. Because when people were forced to question their own judgment, they rarely changed without resistance. And somewhere inside Romano International, someone was not worried about Elena gaining recognition. They were worried about what she might discover next. The morning after the review meeting, the atmosphere inside Romano International had changed. The same glass walls, the same polished floors, and the same busy offices remained exactly as they were before. But something invisible had shifted. People were no longer looking at Elena Carter the same way. Some looked curious. Some looked uncomfortable. And some quietly wondered how they had failed to notice the person who had been sitting beside Alessandro Romano for years. But respect was not something Elena expected to receive overnight. She had spent too much time being underestimated to believe that one meeting could change everyone's opinion. She knew appearances were powerful. They shaped first impressions before people ever learned the truth. That was why she had always focused on her work instead of trying to prove herself. Still, the attention brought new challenges. Not everyone appreciated that Alessandro had started asking for her opinion during important discussions. Not everyone liked that the person they had dismissed as an assistant was now being listened to as a trusted advisor. Inside the executive lounge, several senior members of the company gathered to discuss the partnership review. Elena entered with a folder in her hand, prepared to present the latest information. The conversation stopped for a moment. One of the executives smiled politely. "I suppose we are having another presentation from Elena today." His words sounded friendly, but the meaning behind them was clear. Elena placed the folder on the table without reacting. "I prepared the updated analysis you requested." Another executive looked through the pages. "You have to understand why some people are surprised. These decisions usually come from experienced leaders." Elena looked at him calmly. "Experience matters. But so does attention." The room became quiet. She was not being disrespectful. She was simply stating a fact. Alessandro, sitting at the end of the table, watched carefully. He noticed how Elena handled criticism. She did not become defensive. She did not try to win an argument. She allowed the information to speak for itself. That was something he admired. Many people wanted to appear intelligent. Elena simply wanted the right answer. As the discussion continued, another concern appeared. Several executives questioned whether Elena's conclusions were based on personal assumptions rather than professional analysis. They suggested that perhaps she had misunderstood the situation. Alessandro listened to every opinion. Then he turned to Elena. "What is your response?" For a moment everyone waited. They expected hesitation. They expected uncertainty. Instead, Elena calmly opened her folder and placed several pages on the table. These are the comparisons between the original proposal and the revised version. These are the timeline changes. These are the areas where the language shifted. She explained every point clearly. No emotion. No unnecessary words. Just facts. The room slowly changed. The people who questioned her realized they were not listening to someone making a guess. They were listening to someone who had done the work before anyone else thought to begin. After the meeting ended, Elena walked through the quiet hallway toward her office. She knew the questions would continue. She knew some people would still judge her by what they saw first. But she also knew something important had changed. Alessandro had started trusting her publicly, and that meant more than any compliment. Later that afternoon, Alessandro stopped by her office. It was unusual. He rarely visited employees personally. "You handled yourself well today," he said. Elena looked up from her computer. "Thank you." There was a pause. Then Alessandro added, "You know, most people would have reacted differently." Elena smiled slightly. "Most people spend a lot of time trying to prove they belong. I have always preferred showing it." Those words stayed with him after he left. Because Alessandro realized Elena had never needed a title, attention, or approval to demonstrate her value. She had earned her place quietly, one decision at a time. But while the company was beginning to recognize her abilities, someone else was watching. Someone who knew Elena had uncovered something that was never meant to be discovered. And that person was becoming increasingly concerned about how much she truly knew. The warning signs were there long before anyone realized there was a problem. In a company built on careful planning and precise decisions, small changes rarely happen by accident. Elena Carter understood that better than anyone. She had spent years studying patterns, noticing differences, and asking the questions other people were too busy to ask. But now, after gaining Alessandro Romano's trust, she discovered that the situation was larger than a simple mistake in a contract. Something deeper was happening inside the company. Late that evening, Elena sat alone in her office, surrounded by reports and financial records displayed across her computer screen. The city outside her window was covered in golden lights, but she barely noticed. Her focus remained on the information in front of her. She compared old documents with recent updates, reviewing every change carefully. The more she looked, the clearer the pattern became. The adjustments were not random. They were carefully placed. Someone had been making small changes over time, hoping nobody would connect them. Elena leaned back in her chair and thought about every meeting she had attended during the past few months. She remembered conversations that felt slightly unusual, questions that were avoided, decisions that moved forward too quickly. At the time, each moment seemed insignificant. Together, they created a picture that could not be ignored. The next morning, Elena arrived early at Romano International. The building was still quiet, with only a few employees moving through the lobby. She preferred these early hours because they gave her time to think without distractions. As she entered her office, she noticed something unexpected. A folder she had requested the previous day was already placed on her desk. Inside were updated financial reports she had not seen before. Elena opened the documents and immediately noticed another inconsistency. The numbers had been adjusted again. Whoever was responsible was still trying to protect whatever they had changed. But now Elena was paying attention. And once Elena Carter paid attention, very little escaped her. She brought the information directly to Alessandro's office. He looked up as she entered. Unlike before, he did not question why she was there. He simply listened. "There are more changes," Elena said. This is not just about one contract. Someone has been carefully controlling information before it reaches you. Alessandro looked at the reports. His expression remained calm, but Elena noticed the seriousness in his eyes. How certain are you? He asked. Certain enough to keep looking, she replied. But I need access to the original records. Alessandro nodded. You will have it. Those simple words meant more than Elena expected. For years she had worked beside him, proving herself through results. But now he was giving her something more valuable than approval. He was giving her trust. Over the next several days, Elena continued her review. She followed the timeline of every document, every revision, and every decision. Slowly, the pieces began connecting. The changes were not coming from outside the company. They were connected to someone who understood the internal process. Someone who knew how decisions were made. Someone who knew exactly where people would stop looking. Alessandro noticed the long hours she was spending. One evening, he found her still working at her desk. You should go home, he said. Elena looked up and smiled slightly. I will when I finish understanding this. Alessandro looked at the reports around her. Most people would have stopped after proving their point. Elena returned her attention to the screen. Because most people want to be right. I want to make sure the truth is complete. For a moment Alessandro said nothing. Those words stayed with him because they revealed something important about Elena. She was not searching for recognition. She was not trying to gain influence. She was following the truth wherever it led. And that was exactly why the person hiding the information had made a mistake. They had underestimated the one person who would never stop looking. By the end of the week, Elena discovered the final connection. A series of decisions, approvals, and hidden adjustments all pointed toward the same source. She stared at the name on the document and realized the truth was far more personal than she expected. The betrayal was not coming from a distant competitor. It was coming from someone Alessandro trusted. The name on the document remained on Elena Carter's screen, unmoving and impossible to ignore. For several seconds she simply stared at it, hoping there was another explanation. A misunderstanding. A mistake. Anything that would make the truth less difficult to accept. But the more she reviewed the records, the more certain she became. The person connected to the hidden changes was someone who had been sitting inside Alessandro Romano's circle of trust for years. Someone who had access, influence, and a reason to believe nobody would question them. Elena closed the file and took a quiet breath. She knew what this meant. Discovering the truth was one thing. Presenting it was another. In a company where loyalty mattered as much as success, accusing the wrong person could damage relationships that had taken decades to build. Elena did not want to create suspicion. She wanted to protect the truth. That was always the difference between her and everyone else. The next morning, Alessandro called a private meeting with the senior executives. The atmosphere was different from the previous meetings. There was no celebration, no casual conversation. Everyone could feel that something important was about to happen. Elena entered the room carrying a small folder. This time nobody questioned why she was there. They had learned that when Elena spoke, there was usually a reason. Alessandro sat at the head of the table, looking over the information she had prepared. Before we discuss anything else, he said, we need to review what was changed and why. Several executives exchanged uncertain looks. One of them, Victor Hayes, a longtime business partner of Alessandro, remained unusually calm. Victor had worked with the Romano organization for more than a decade. He was respected, experienced, and known as someone who understood the company better than almost anyone. That was exactly why Elena had been careful. The truth was difficult because trust made people vulnerable. Elena connected her laptop to the screen. The first document appeared. This is the original version of the agreement, she explained. Then the second document appeared beside it. This is the revised version. The differences were small, almost invisible, but Elena highlighted each change. These adjustments created a different outcome than what was originally approved. The room became quiet. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. The same people who once questioned her abilities were now watching every detail she presented. Victor leaned forward. Are you suggesting someone intentionally changed these documents? His voice remained controlled. Elena looked at him. I am saying the changes required access and knowledge of our internal process. She chose her words carefully. She was not making accusations without proof. She was presenting facts. Alessandro watched the exchange without speaking. He had always valued people who could handle pressure, but Elena showed something even more rare. She could remain calm when the entire room was waiting for her to fail. She continued explaining the timeline. Every revision, every approval, every moment where the information changed. The pattern became impossible to ignore. By the end of her presentation, the room was silent. Alessandro looked around the table. He saw the uncertainty on people's faces. He saw the questions they were afraid to ask. Then he looked at Elena. For years, many people had assumed she was near him because of her position. They never understood that she was near him because she had earned his trust every single day. "Elena," Alessandro said quietly, "is there anything else?" She hesitated for a moment. Then she opened the final file. "Yes, there is one more thing." Everyone looked toward the screen. The final information appeared, connecting the hidden adjustments to a specific person and a specific chain of decisions. The room went completely still. The truth was no longer hidden. The person who thought they could remain unnoticed had been exposed, not by power, but by patience and attention. Alessandro looked at the evidence in silence. Then he looked at Elena, the woman everyone had underestimated. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood the same thing. The person they believed was only there to take notes had been the one protecting everything they built. For a moment, nobody in the conference room moved. The evidence remained displayed on the large screen, clear enough for everyone to understand what had happened. The careful changes, the hidden adjustments, and the decisions made without proper approval were no longer unanswered questions. The truth had finally stepped into the room. But the most important moment was not the discovery itself. It was the realization that the person who uncovered everything had been standing there all along. Elena Carter quietly closed the folder in front of her. She did not look proud. She did not look satisfied. She simply looked relieved that Alessandro finally had the information he needed. Across the table, Victor Hayes remained silent. The confidence he carried into the meeting had disappeared. For years, he had been seen as one of Alessandro's most trusted advisors. Someone with experience. Someone whose opinions carried weight. But trust was not measured by how long someone stood beside you. It was measured by the choices they made when nobody was watching. Alessandro looked at the documents again. His expression remained calm, but everyone in the room could sense the disappointment behind his silence. He had built his company by believing in loyalty, discipline, and careful judgment. Discovering that someone close to him had broken that trust forced him to question something much deeper than a business decision. It forced him to question how easily people could hide behind reputation. After the meeting ended, the executives slowly left the room. Nobody spoke as they walked through the hallway. The same people who once whispered that Elena was only a secretary now avoided making assumptions about her. They had seen the difference between appearance and ability. They had learned that the quietest person in the room was not always the least important. Elena stayed behind to organize her notes. She expected Alessandro to leave with the others. Instead, he remained near the window, looking over the city below. "You knew this would not be easy," he said. Elena looked up. "Yes. You knew people would question you." "Yes." Alessandro turned toward her. "Then why did you keep going?" Elena paused. She had asked herself the same question many times. She could have stayed silent. She could have avoided conflict. She could have protected her own position. But that was never who she was. "Because someone needed to look at the details," she answered. "And because ignoring the truth would have been worse." Alessandro studied her for a long moment. In his world, many people wanted something from him. They wanted opportunities, influence, or recognition. But Elena had always been different. She never asked for anything in return. She simply did her job with a level of dedication that most people never noticed. "For years," Alessandro said quietly, "I thought I understood everyone around me." Elena remained silent. "I was wrong." Those two words carried more meaning than any compliment he could have given. Alessandro Romano was a man who rarely admitted mistakes. Yet standing there, he understood one of his biggest mistakes had been assuming Elena's value was limited to her title. She had never been just the person who managed his schedule. She was the person who noticed what others missed. The person who spoke when silence would have been easier. The person who protected the company without asking anyone to see her effort. The next day, something changed inside Romano International. Employees who once ignored Elena began asking for her opinion. Executives who once interrupted her began listening. But Elena remained the same. She arrived early. She reviewed documents carefully. She focused on the work instead of the attention. Because recognition was never what she wanted. Respect was enough. And while the company finally began to see Elena for who she truly was, Alessandro realized something even more important. The person he trusted most had never been the person with the loudest voice or the highest position. She had been the person quietly standing beside him, protecting the future everyone else was too distracted to notice. Weeks passed after the truth was revealed, but the memory of that meeting remained inside Romano International. Not because of the documents, the decisions, or the business challenges that followed. It remained because everyone remembered the moment when their assumptions changed. They remembered the quiet woman who had stood in the corner of the room for years, listening carefully while others rushed to speak. They remembered the person they had underestimated becoming the person they trusted the most. Elena Carter never changed after that day. She still arrived early every morning. She still reviewed every detail before making a decision. She still carried the same notebook she had used when she first joined the company years before. The only difference was that people finally understood what had always been there. Her value had never depended on whether others noticed it. It had existed long before anyone gave it a name. Inside Alessandro Romano's office, the atmosphere had also changed. Their conversations were no longer limited to schedules and reports. Alessandro began asking for Elena's perspective before important meetings. Not because she worked for him, because he respected her judgment. One afternoon, as the city lights appeared beyond the office windows, Alessandro looked through a series of reports Elena had prepared. "You realize you changed how this company makes decisions," he said. Elena looked up from her desk. "I only pointed out what was already there." Alessandro smiled slightly. "That is exactly what makes you different." For most of his career, Alessandro had been surrounded by people who wanted to impress him. They prepared perfect presentations, offered confident answers, and tried to appear certain even when they were not. Elena did something completely different. She asked the difficult questions. She searched for the details everyone ignored. She cared more about finding the right answer than receiving credit for finding it. That was why Alessandro trusted her. Not because she was always correct. Nobody was. He trusted her because she had the courage to search for the truth even when it was uncomfortable. The company continued to grow, and Elena's role naturally expanded. She became involved in larger projects and worked directly with senior leadership. Yet despite the new responsibilities, she remained the same person. She never used her position to make others feel small. She remembered what it felt like to be ignored. She remembered what it felt like when people judged her before hearing her thoughts. Because of that, she treated every person around her with the same respect she had always wanted for herself. Months later, during another important meeting, a new employee questioned one of Elena's suggestions. The room became quiet for a moment, and everyone waited to see what would happen. Before Elena could respond, Alessandro spoke. "Listen carefully. The person who notices the smallest details is often the person who protects everyone from the biggest mistakes." Nobody argued. Nobody laughed. They had learned that lesson already. After the meeting, Elena stood near the same conference room window where everything had started. She looked down at the city below and remembered the day when people saw only what they wanted to see. They saw a title. They saw an appearance. They saw someone they believed they understood. But they never saw the dedication behind the silence. They never saw the intelligence behind the calm expression. They never saw the strength it took to continue doing the right thing without recognition. Alessandro joined her a moment later. Neither of them spoke at first. Sometimes silence carried more meaning than words. Finally, he said, "You know, they were wrong about you." Elena looked at him. "They only saw what they expected to see." Alessandro nodded. "And I almost made the same mistake." Elena smiled softly. "But you looked closer." Outside, the city continued moving. Beneath the evening sky. Inside, a company that once measured people by appearances had learned a different lesson. A person's worth was never defined by the first thing others noticed. It was revealed through actions, patience, and the courage to stand for what was right. And that day, the world remembered that true respect is not given to those who demand attention. It is earned by those who quietly prove their value when nobody is watching.